Hi everyone, welcome back to Info 3370, studying social inequality with data science. We've just talked about views of justice, and in particular we talked most recently about Nozick's view that people have a right to their holdings if those holdings are acquired through just acquisitions and just transfers. And so today we're going to turn to how the distribution of holdings in the US actually arose through historical processes. And we're going to focus on the political origins of wealth inequality. Before class, I asked you to watch this NPR video introducing redlining, and we're going to cover many of those same topics in class today. So our learning goals are to be able to conceptually trace the origins of wealth inequality to explicitly racist policies that started in the 1930s, and at the end of class we'll also turn to an exercise where you can map racial segregation in a city of your choosing. I want to take us back to the 30s. So in the 1930s, the US is in the midst of the Great Depression, and people are hurting. This famous picture shows people in a bread line waiting for public support because they're unemployed and they are barely scraping by. While America had been living in a land of plenty in the 1920s, by the 1930s, the world seemed to have a more somber outlook. People are stuck in dead-end jobs, if they have jobs at all, and we're all kind of tired and running out of hope and looking for some path forward. In the midst of the Great Depression, Franklin Delano Roosevelt comes in, and he starts signing bill after bill. So FDR gets people together and he puts government into action. And one bill that FDR signs is the Federal Housing Act of 1934. This is the building where the Homeowners Loan Corporation was located in Washington, D.C. The Federal Housing Act sought to expand access to home ownership for many Americans. In particular, it set up a process where the federal government would back mortgages so that banks could loan money to people who perhaps otherwise wouldn't have qualified for a home loan. And this really spurred the notion of home ownership as part of the American dream, and it's carried on through today, where even today, federally backed mortgages are really important for people to be able to own homes. So the Homeowners Loan Corporation was tasked, among other things, to decide which mortgages the government would back and which mortgages the government would not back. And so they had to think about what mortgages were safe or secure. And they decided to do this to rate neighborhoods. So a neighborhood was seen as safe if you could trust that the home values are going to keep going up in that neighborhood. And so the mortgage was pretty safe, because if the person defaulted, you could always sell the home and get the money back. So they rated neighborhoods from A, coded green, and that's like the most desirable neighborhoods, down to D, coded red. That's the undesirable neighborhoods. And you might ask yourself, how did they decide which neighborhoods were deemed desirable and undesirable? And this is where some troubling facts start to enter the story. So how did they decide this? They followed a process now known as redlining. In particular, if there were very many low-income immigrants in the neighborhood, then that neighborhood got a D grade. And likewise, if there were black families, then that neighborhood got a D grade. And if you want to read more about this, there's plenty of resources. This is one history book that tells a bit about this process and how the HOLC explicitly used these racist policies to determine which neighborhoods would qualify for home loans under federally backed mortgages. They created these maps. So this is what a redlined map looks like. This is Los Angeles, and we can see here how Beverly Hills, which is a very white neighborhood, is coded green. So that was A. It was easy to get a mortgage if you were getting it for a home in Beverly Hills. Whereas like South Central LA, home to a more racially diverse population, is coded yellow and red, two of the bottom categories for qualification for a mortgage. And we can often see some connections between the maps of these political decisions made in the 1930s and maps of, for example, racial segregation today, where today we still see that Beverly Hills is an extremely non-black neighborhood, whereas here in South Central we have a very high proportion of people identifying as black. This isn't just a story about LA. We could pick basically any city we want. So here's Buffalo. We can see there are red-lined neighborhoods here, whereas these neighborhoods up here were given the go-ahead for getting mortgages. And we can see that there's still racial segregation today. Here's Chicago, and here's Chicago's racial segregation today. So it wasn't just the federal government. Local organizations also furthered racist policies. I'm showing you here a little pamphlet from the Blue Ridge community in northwest Seattle. William Boeing of the Boeing Company bought a bunch of land and decided to make this beautiful suburban neighborhood with grass and homes and make it really attractive for people to live there. But there's a dark side. So this neighborhood had a homeowners association, and in the policies of that homeowners association, they had a policy about additions to your property. 16 racial restrictions. No property in said addition shall at any time be sold, conveyed, rented, or leased in whole or in part to any person or persons not of the white or Caucasian race. So this is wild. This is not Mississippi in the Civil War. This is Seattle in the early 20th century. And these neighborhoods were using these explicitly racist policies to keep black families out of these neighborhoods. And still today, this neighborhood is extremely white in northwest Seattle. So explicitly racist policies, they had lasting consequences. So they affect where people live over time, both in the past and today. This is a figure from Jacob Faber's 2020 paper, which really goes over the consequences of these New Deal policies and how they created American segregation that we see today. So here he's looking at a measure of black isolation. So this is the degree to which black families live in neighborhoods filled with only other black families and not families of other racial categories. And Faber uses the fact that some areas got appraised by the HOLC and some areas did not, because HOLC was doing a lot of stuff then. It was hard to get to every neighborhood. And so some areas didn't get redlined in the ways that other areas did get redlined. And so we see here how the unappraised neighborhoods on the solid line have relatively constant black isolation over the period, whereas the appraised neighborhoods were similar before the policies in the Great Depression. And then after this redlining occurred, black isolation shot up in these neighborhoods and remained high beyond that point. So redlining was not just a reflection of racial segregation, but it was actually a cause of further racial segregation down the road. Next, I want to turn to the wealth consequences of redlining. So if you think about how Americans build wealth, you might think of like stocks and bonds, but for the vast majority of Americans, the way they build wealth is through equity in their home. And this is a story with two very different patterns based on who you are. So in the redlined neighborhoods, it's hard to sell your home because no one can get a loan to buy your home since it's in a neighborhood that the government has deemed like not worthy of receiving loans. It's also hard to buy a home because you also can't get a loan yourself. As a result, home prices don't rise, and so people don't really build wealth that way. Meanwhile, in these very white suburbs, where there were very few black people to begin with, and black people were excluded through both federal and local policies, homeownership skyrockets. So the federal government was subsidizing loans to help people more easily buy homes, and thus homeownership rose from 44% nationally to 62% nationally over a period of 20 years. As people bought these homes, home prices rose and wealth grows for these families. And if you want to track this history, I would recommend Oliver and Shapiro's book, Black Wealth, White Wealth, which really looks at the various sources of wealth inequality between black and white families today. So generally, here are many possible additional resources you could go to on this topic. It's not really possible in one lecture to cover all the aspects of redlining and political origins of wealth inequality. But I hope I've given you a taste to understand that you might want to step back and think, if a family has a lot of wealth today, perhaps this was created not through their own merit or their own work, but through the racist policies that existed through decades past. So what will we do next? Over the next few classes, we will map racial segregation using Social Explorer, which is a tool that uses census data and lets you look at the distribution of racial groups across different neighborhoods in any city of your choosing. We also have an exercise where we'll document racial wealth gaps using R, using data from the Survey of Consumer Finances. And then third, we'll discuss a bit about normatively what should be done about this problem. So once we realize that wealth has these particularly problematic origins, this should cause us to think about what policies perhaps ought to be enacted to help rectify those past injustices. So I'll stop there for today.